Well, Merry Christmas. This is a season that it's grown on me over the past couple of years. I've made the joke a couple times. It's not really a joke in different sermons talking about how I used to hate Christmas music. And I would always dread when that was the thing that was going to be on every station and take over my regular worship music, because in many ways I saw Christmas as not really a worshipful music until I started to really learn what it meant that our God became a man. And I started hearing the lyrics speaking about this reality of the King of the universe, as this just said, laying in straw. And just the magnitude of what we're given in this season. But for a moment, for today, what I'm going to ask is that until later on in the sermon, I want us to forget that we know who Jesus is. I want us to go back to this phrase that Ashley read earlier. Let us run with endurance the race that lies before us, keeping our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Over the next 2 weeks, we're going to talk about those two terms, the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith. But to go back to being the pioneer, if you are a pioneer in something, you are someone who goes out before others. You're the first. You're the one setting the course, charting the plan, going into unexplored territory. You're someone that's going where others have not gone before. And to talk about Jesus, that first phrase, being the pioneer of our faith, we have to go back to before the name Jesus was known. We have to go back, as the book of Hebrews does, to trace the lineage of faith that has existed in humanity, of people following God, pursuing Him, learning who He is, and God revealing Himself to us. And so, though it's impossible, let's try for 30 minutes to just take Jesus and that name and pretend that we don't know who He is. We look at this plan that's laid out, this charted course that God set before all of humanity was even created, when God made us and created us in His image, created us to be in this relationship with Him. And that's the first thing that we can see. We're going to go back to Hebrews 11 to help us understand what the author of Hebrews means by this pioneer and perfecter of our faith. But the first thing is God's close relationship with us was always plan A. When God made you and me, when He made Adam and Eve at the very beginning, the intention was always for God and man to dwell together, to walk with one another, to commune with one another, to know one another. Hebrews 11, chapter 1, or verse 1 says, "Now faith is the reality of what is hoped for, the proof of what is not seen. For by this our ancestors were approved." And I used to think about that. That phrase, faith is the reality of what is hoped for, the proof of what is not seen. And think, that sounds kind of like a philosophical cliche that someone says and you're like, oh, that's a wise person. But you really don't get what they're saying. And so I just remember thinking through, okay, what is this? It's the reality of something that is hoped for. And I think what we have to remember is the context of which faith is demanded of us. Faith is demanded of us in this relationship where our relationship with God is broken. Faith is something that God asks of us, that God enables in us because we have strayed from His original design. When Adam and Eve were walking in the garden looking at God, they knew Him, they saw Him, they were with Him. And when they broke that relationship, it has constantly been a turning back, remembering what was lost and striving towards that. It's been relying on God's promises that this broken world that we have messed up is not going to stay that way. It's looking for the time when God will redeem all things, restore us to what we were originally intended to be with Him. That is the reality that is longed for. When it's talking about faith, It's the reality of what is hoped for. It's saying faith is believing that that really exists. That state, that condition where humanity walks with God, is known by Him and knows Him. And there is peace that overshadows that relationship and no longer strife and war. That humans walk in the image that their God made them in, and they're able to do so in a way that brings life and prosperity and not further death and destruction to the world around them. That this reality, we look around and it's hard to ever see it. I mean, if you look around, if you go to the news, if you look at any sort of information about what is going on in our world right now, it is hard to imagine that this perfect state of man and God dwelling together in a way that builds up and nurtures is real. We can look in our own homes and see that. I mean, I have fights in my home. Not like fist fights, but like me and my wife, we don't get along sometimes. I get annoyed with my kids. I get annoyed with friends. I misread into what people are saying and doing. I hold on to grudges sometimes. There are times that we have this brokenness in us where we don't have to look beyond the mirror to see that this reality that we talk about so often in Scripture of God and man dwelling together, choosing to live according to God's ways, and it bringing life and prosperity, it's lost on us. We can't see it when we look around. But this wasn't something that was lost permanently, at least if we believe God. And that's the crux of this. Faith is the reality of what is hoped for. It's like a place where the barrier between what God intended for us to be and the reality of this messed up world, that fabric that separates the two is being stretched. And it's like there's starting to be little holes that open up and you can see glimpses of light coming through. Faith is choosing to believe that reality exists and then we hope for it. But the incredible thing is that it's not just us looking forward and saying, God, I hope that that's real. There's also this reaching back that God does, where God seems to, when we have faith, when we're choosing to follow Him and believe Him, it seems like God breaks heaven through, starts to bring heaven to earth. And so when it's talking about faith, the reality of what is hoped for, it's saying these, our ancestors of the faith, looked forward to what God had made and said it's real, it exists, and we're going to strive for it. And then the proof came through. And you see God doing incredible and miraculous things in their lives. You see heaven breaking through the veil to be on earth around these people. For this is how our ancestors were approved. They looked past the broken circumstances that we live in, and they didn't say, this is the only reality. Instead, they recognized because God is who He is, and He does not fail, and His word always comes through. I can guarantee you that that reality will come again. And I'm going to strive for it in this life. I'm going to seek to be like that in this life. But they were not perfect. These were broken men and women striving towards that. But they looked forward to a day. They longed for a day when it would not be a hope anymore, and it wouldn't have to be by faith. It would be by sight, that they would see the reality that God made this world to reside in. They would see it come and live and dwell among us again. That they would start to see the darkness driven back and the curse of sin erased. To see the land and the people healed and relationships restored and brought back together. This is what they were longing for. And again, our mind wants to immediately run to Jesus. But for us to really settle into how the people prior to Jesus' coming would have handled these promises, would have thought about this, we need to for a moment, try to suspend just jumping to, oh, we see that in Jesus. Because imagine that you're longing for this reality, and there are times that you glimpse it. By faith, we understand that the universe was created by the Word of God, so that what is seen was made from things that are not visible. As God revealed himself in Genesis very clearly to be the creator of the world. And then building off of that reality, by faith, Abel offered to God a sacrifice better than Cain. By faith, he was approved as a righteous man because God approved his gifts. Even though he is dead, he still speaks through his faith. By faith, Enoch was taken away so that he did not experience death. He was not to be found because God took him away. For before he was taken away, he was approved as one who pleased God. Now, without faith, it is impossible to please God, since the one who draws near to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek them. It is recognizing that that perfect reality that is our God exists, and that when we seek after him, he doesn't stand back and say, keep trying more and more and more. He made us to have a relationship with him. It was plan A. We pursue him. He reaches back. He rewards those who pursue him. And so, they live by faith. All of the Old Testament examples of faith that we have, they lived looking forward to something that would potentially come. You get, and this is us, and the second point I want us to see is faith. Us living independence on God, on what he has set the world to be, on him bringing it about, on him restoring things, trusting God is good and will accomplish what he says. Faith was always a part of the plan. We can look at sometimes God creating humankind and us falling as if God's plan A didn't work out, and now we got to move on to plan B. But God's plan all along was to teach us our need of him. He made us in his image. He gave us choice to where we could choose to love him or not to love him. We had the option laid before us. We made the choice, and he knew our choice that we would make. The miraculous thing is, he didn't step away from it. The miraculous thing is that God, after being the God who says, I have created you in a world of bliss, I have given you all that you need. I will be your God, and you will be my people. Go, live, prosper. And we said, no, we don't need you. I'm going to have my own way of doing this. I'm going to pursue my own standards of good and bliss. I'm not going to trust your ways. I'm going to run away. Instead of him abandoning and stepping away, he steps in. He makes the promises, and he calls us to faith. If there was a lesson that was going to be learned, one that I think when Christ comes back will be fully settled, is going to be, is it better for humans to have faith and trust in God or not? That will not be left to question anymore. And so, we have stories of men and women choosing that in a broken world. That's another miraculous thing. For humans who live in a world that is broken, that is sinful, that turns away from God, for them in the middle of that to turn to God and say, over and above everything I see and feel, I will trust you. I have more confidence in who you are than my own understanding and what I feel right now in this moment. It's not something to shake a stick at. It is incredible to see men like Abraham, where God shows up and says, I want you to leave everything you know. I want you to leave your family. I want you to leave the home that you grew up in. And I want you to go to a land that I promise I will give to you. And I'm going to give you many descendants, but you're not going to see those many descendants. And I'm going to give this land to you, but only after 400 years of your people being enslaved. And for a man to say, I trust you. and go. Of the story of Sarah, who in her 90s, God tells her, you are going to have a child. And yes, there's some scoffing and there's some doubting, but there's ultimately belief, as the author of Hebrew tells us, that he will keep his promise and give her a child. Or Abraham, when that promised child, this is a child born to a 90-year-old couple, that God said, all of my promises will be fulfilled through this child, okay? For God to then come to him and test him and say, I want you to take that child and offer him up as a sacrifice to me. That seems cruel. I've told you, my belief with testing is never that God's testing us so that he can find out what we're really made of. It's usually he's testing us so that we find out what we're really made of. And so as Abraham walks up this hill, his heart is being put on full display to himself and to his son. Is it better to trust in this son is here? He is a physical reality. He can have children. If I want descendants, I can keep him alive and he will have my grandchildren. It's guaranteed. Or is it more certain that God, who gave us this miraculous child to begin with, that even if I were to take him up and sacrifice him, my God will keep his promise and will raise him from the dead and give me those descendants? That was what Abraham thought. The author of Hebrews makes it very clear that he believed that even if God had to raise him from the dead, he would still keep his promises. This is faith. It's the interplay of us trusting in a God above and beyond who we are in our own understanding. You have Isaac and Jacob, who walked through their own times of believing and trusting God. We have Joseph, the story of going into Egypt and trusting God's ways and living as a good principled man and being exalted and established and to the second most authoritative person in Egypt so that he could save his people from a famine. We get the story of Moses, as Sage taught so well on last week, of Moses choosing to believe God and lead God's people through the wilderness, that he identified with God's people over and above the Egyptian family where he was royalty. He gave up power and prestige and privilege so that he could go and be with God's people, which is ultimately more about trusting. If you've ever been around God's people, it's more about trusting in God than people. And so, faith was always part of the plan. That we were going to encounter situations where we didn't have all the answers, but it was going to be ultimately about what you believed about God more than anything else. The third thing I want us to see, and this is where I'm going to shift our attention back. Jesus becoming a man was plan A all along. What more fully captures the idea of God creating us special in his image to be united with him, for him to be our God and we to be his people, God and man together, undivided, than God himself being willing to become a man? But think about this. Think about where you would be prior to Jesus coming. Think about the decades of generations who are looking forward to when God's going to finally reveal his master plan, his ultimate salvation of the world, and how long you would have asked questions like, is it actually real? Or are we just all delusional? Are we tricking ourselves that this God really cares for us? Has he deceived us? Does he really care about us? I mean, look at our sufferings that we've been going through. Like the Egyptians when they were enslaved, as Sage pointed out last week. To look at God in those moments and to just say, how can we truly trust this God? And I think if Jesus never came, there might be legitimate answers. But here's the reality. Jesus came. God himself humbled himself to taking on human flesh. This was not an insignificant decision. And we're going to talk about this more next week. Just exactly what all it means that Jesus became man. But this wasn't a temporary, okay, I'll take on a human body for 33 years and then move along. This was Jesus, like in a marriage covenant, binding himself to us for eternity. There will never be a point at which you stand in eternity future and look on Jesus and you are not looking face to face with a man. Like, just, if I told you that you could save all of the ants on the earth, like, not like ants like family, like ants like little, crawls into your pantry, takes your food. You just had to commit to yourself being an ant for all of eternity. My God, King of the universe, the one who angels obey his commands, and the winds and the waves die down when he speaks, stooped so low that for eternity he will be identified with us by forever bearing flesh and bone like you and me. Like, that's just, it would be very reasonable for many decades of seeing God's promises not fulfilled to look at God and say, I don't really know who you are. Are you really the God that's going to keep your word in the way that you talk about? Are you not? But something that is wiped away is when we truly look at and behold who Jesus is. It's impossible to not see the commitment that God has to us. You know, we talk, it's easy when you have a relationship with someone for you to kind of doubt their motives and not understand why they're doing what they're doing. You know, you do it with friends, you do it with coworkers, you do it with spouses, and it's because you ultimately really can't see in that person's heart. But something that does happen is that you can do these really grand gestures, not like buying roses on Valentine's. That's not grand. Everybody does it. But it's usually unique to the individual that you're trying to love or trying to prove your relationship to. There can be these really grand things where you know this is going to mean the world to them. And it's going to come at great sacrifice to myself. And so I'm going to go after this. And you do this grand demonstration that costs you severely to prove you really do care about them, to take what is in your heart and to put it on full display for that person. God of the universe became man to prove his love for you. There's no great divorce. There's no walking away. There's no separating himself from us ever again. It's what Paul says in the book of Romans. If he has not withheld his only son for us, how will he not give us all things? What can separate us from the love of God that is shown to us in Christ Jesus? There's nothing. The miraculous part of Jesus laying in a manger was we finally get to see what our ancestors longed for so long. Starting in verse 32, and what more can I say? Time is too short for me to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms. So remember, by faith, they're looking for something they have not seen. They're choosing to believe God even though they haven't seen the fulfillment of what they're longing for. By faith, they conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, gained strength in weakness, became mighty in battle, put foreign enemies to fight. Women received their dead raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting release so that they may gain a better resurrection. Others experienced mockings and scourgings, as well as bonds and imprisonments. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they died by the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated, The world was not worthy of them. This world, this broken world. They wandered in deserts and on mountains, hiding in caves and holes in the ground. They were all approved through their faith, but they did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, so that they would not be made perfect without us. What was that better thing? What was the thing that they were looking forward to, that even though they didn't see, was so appealing, so captivating, that they would suffer in these ways by this world so that they may strive for it and believe God would send it? Well, we're told they all died in faith. This is verse 13. Although they had not received the things that were promised, but they saw them from a distance, greeted them, and confessed that they were foreigners and temporary residents on earth. Now, those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they were thinking about where they came from, they would have had an opportunity to return, but they now desire a better place, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, and He has prepared a city for them. Faith. Choosing to look forward to the promises that God would bring to us. That blending of the perfect reality that He made us to exist in and the broken world in which we currently reside in. The way that those two would start to intermingle until the perfect reality drove away and dispelled the darkness of our world. That's what they looked forward to. The day when God would restore us, bring back life to our world, to redeem us. He would not have any more broken families, any more addiction, any more of us being dominated by different vices and sins that we can't shake. No more destroying relationships, no more death. And when was that perfectly going to be realized? Ultimately, we know when Christ comes again. But God was kind to us and gave us a glimpse of it in the God-man, Jesus. The man who decided, I'm not going to live according to the ways that this world has set. Instead, we see a man who stepped into situations where there was sickness and He would heal it, and the sickness fled. We saw a man who spoke truth and lies were dissolved. We saw a man who drew near to his Father and communed with Him as one. We saw a man who walked with God in faith because, yes, as a man, Jesus also had to live by faith. We saw a man who kept God's law perfectly and found it was not cumbersome. It did not rob joy from his life, but instead was a man of perfect peace and joy himself. In Jesus, we see that the promise of God is yes and amen and will come true. In Jesus, where God became man, we see both how much God cares for you and for me. And we also see that God's ways, what He commanded and has given us, do not produce more suffering in this world, but instead dispel the kingdom of darkness and establish the kingdom of heaven. It's why Jesus would say, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heaven, it's not this lofty place that we go to that's void and ethereal and we float around, and it's living with God. It's knowing Him and be fully known. It's why Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is at hand when He was going around teaching. Because everywhere He stepped, the kingdom of heaven advanced. He was a one-man army driving back the forces of darkness. He was the promises of God coming to their conclusion. He was the proof of concept that living like how God gave us, it actually produces what God told us it would. And not only that, it's not a proof of concept that only works in a perfect environment. In fact, living and following God in this way, loving God, drawing near to Him, and being one like Him, even in the most messed up environment where the Son of God himself would be killed and betrayed by a friend, it still would bring life. It still would redeem. The evil could not overcome it. And so God became man. God became man so that you and I could be drawn back to him. We have a treasure that has been given to us, something that we can't fathom how much it's worth. That God himself would become one of us, and that he would call out to us to come to him. And the same promise that caused all of these heroes of the faith to persevere despite the suffering, despite the difficulty, despite the inward groaning. To persevere is the same thing that he offers to you and me. It is this proof that God's not done with this world. That for a moment, for 33 years of human history, heaven broke into this world. And since then, it has been going out in the lives of those who truly believe that God exists and that he rewards those who pursue him. And so, next week, we're going to talk about just some of the incredible things about Jesus being a man. I'm humbled, but also so proud to be identified with him. You look at the man that is Jesus and the love he's shown for you and me. You look at how he has served and humbled himself to bring us near. When you look at the love that he has for you and for me, I don't think there's a way for us to see it, to behold it, and to walk away and say, well, that's a nice story. If we truly see who he is, I think there's something we recognize. I think you recognize both things that you long for in your own life and things you wish were more prevalent in this whole world. And so, if you haven't ever come to Jesus, maybe it's just simply because you don't know who he is, I just want to encourage you this season, over the next couple of weeks, read the book of Matthew. Just read through and ask yourself this question: who is this Jesus? Just look at that. And if you don't know what I mean when I say read the book of Matthew, come ask me. I can get you a Bible. I can show you where it's at. But just read it and ask, who is this Jesus? And I think that as you look at him and you see him, what will happen is, if you really are honest, you'll see there are things in this man that I wish were everywhere. This is how I wish humanity lived. This is how I wish humanity loved. And then if you pursue him, he will draw near to you as well. Come and talk to me. We're going to have a couple of songs just to close us out. If you need to come and talk to me, or for me to want to pray, want to come down, whatever the case may be, feel free to respond. And I promise you, you're not going to regret this man, Jesus, and following him or being more.